Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to medieval England. For the young of the medieval world, the boys and girls passing through what we would call their teenage years lived lives that would astonish us today, lives of a freedom and a hardship and a wildness quite unlike anything in our own carefully managed modern youth. They left home younger than we can imagine. They worked and married and fought and caroused in ways that would alarm any modern parent, and they gathered in boisterous bands that the respectable folk of the age regarded with real unease. The medieval teenager, in short, lived a life we would scarcely recognize, and that is the strange and fascinating world we are going to wander through tonight, gently, in the quiet of the dark. So, before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from in the world, and what time it is. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find it comforting to imagine all of us, lying awake in the dark together and drifting back through the centuries to worlds long vanished. Also, if this channel helps carry you off to sleep, tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure at all. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some sweet background hum, and get comfortable, because we have a long and gentle journey ahead of us tonight, back through the centuries to the medieval world and its wild young people. You do not need to remember any of it. That is precisely the point. Everything tonight is gently told, a quiet and curious history held at a soft and comfortable distance, a story to drift away to. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to be young in the medieval world, to grow up in that distant age, to pass from childhood into adulthood in a world so utterly unlike our own? Have you ever wondered how young the medieval young left home, how soon they worked and married, how they played and caroused and gathered in their boisterous bands? Have you ever wondered why the respectable folk of the medieval world regarded their youth with such unease, and what wildness lay behind that ancient worry? These are the things we are going to drift through tonight, slowly and gently, in the dark, the strange and surprising and sometimes wild world of medieval youth. So settle back, let your eyes grow heavy, and let us travel together, softly, across the centuries, to the world of the medieval young. Let us begin, gently, with the most surprising thing of all. The strange fact that the medieval world had no real idea of the teenager at all. The first and strangest thing to understand about the young people of the medieval world is that, in a very real sense, the teenager as we know it did not exist at all. For the medieval world had no concept of that long, protected, in-between stage of life that we now take so completely for granted. This is the key that unlocks so much of what will seem strange about medieval youth, and it makes a fitting place to begin our gentle journey into their world. In our own age, we recognize a long period of adolescence, a stretch of years between childhood and full adulthood, in which the young are neither children nor quite adults, protected and educated, and gradually prepared for the responsibilities of grown-up life. This teenage stage, this extended youth, is so familiar to us that we scarcely think of it as anything but natural, a simple fact of human life. But it is, in truth, very much a creation of our own modern world, and the medieval world knew nothing of it. There was, in the medieval mind, no long protected adolescence, no extended stage of youth set aside for education and gradual preparation. There was childhood, and then, quite soon, there was the world of adult work and responsibility, into which the young passed far earlier than we would think possible. The medieval young, in other words, did not have the luxury of a long, sheltered youth, but were expected to take on the burdens and responsibilities of adult life at an age that would astonish us. A child of the medieval world might pass from the games of childhood into the world of hard labor, while still what we would consider a young child, and by the time they reached the years we call the teens, they were very often already at work, already bearing real responsibilities, already living lives that were, in many respects, adult. The sheltered, protected teenage years that we regard as a natural part of growing up simply did not exist for them, replaced instead by an early and often abrupt entry into the world of adult work and care. And yet, for all this, the medieval world was not entirely blind to the special character of youth. For even without our concept of the teenager, the people of the age recognized that the young were different, that there was a stage of life marked by particular energies and passions and follies, a wildness and a boldness that belonged especially to the young. They knew, as every age has known, that young people were prone to certain excesses, to a boldness and a recklessness, and a passion that could lead them into trouble, and they regarded this youthful wildness with a mixture of tolerance and unease. So while they had no concept of the teenager, they did recognize the special and sometimes troublesome character of youth, the energies and passions that we too associate with the young. It is worth pausing on just how strange this would look to us if we could see it. Imagine a household in which a child of 7 or 8 was already doing real and necessary work, in which a boy of 12 had left home for good and was living among strangers, in which a girl of 14 was running a portion of a household or preparing for marriage. To our eyes, accustomed to seeing such ages as firmly belonging to childhood, this would seem almost a world without children at all, a world in which the young were hurried out of childhood and into the working life of adults with astonishing speed. And yet to the medieval eye there was nothing strange in it whatsoever. It was simply how the world worked, how it had always worked, how it was assumed it always would. The very idea that the young needed a long stretch of protected years before taking on the world's work would have seemed to them not merely wrong but faintly absurd, a luxury no sensible society could afford. This is the great paradox of medieval youth that we will explore tonight, that the young of that age were at once thrust early into the responsibilities of adult life, and yet were also recognized as a distinct and sometimes wild and troublesome group, prone to the follies and excesses of youth. They were, in a sense, both adults and young people at once, bearing adult burdens while still possessed of youthful energies, and this strange combination gave medieval youth its particular and fascinating character. It is a world quite unlike our own careful arrangement of a long, protected adolescence, and understanding this difference is the first step into the strange and surprising world of the medieval young. Let that first strangeness settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the age at which the medieval young left the shelter of home. Perhaps the single most astonishing thing about the medieval young, to our modern eyes, is the age at which they left the shelter of their family home to make their way in the world. For medieval children departed the parental roof at an age that would strike any modern parent as impossibly, alarmingly young. This early leaving of home was one of the defining features of medieval youth, and it shaped the whole experience of growing up in that distant age. In our own world, the young remain at home well into their late teens and often far beyond, sheltered and supported by their families through the long years of adolescence and often well into adulthood. The medieval young enjoyed no such extended shelter, for it was common and entirely unremarkable for children to leave their family homes and go to live and work in other households while still remarkably young, at an age when we would think them mere children. A child of 10 or 12 or 14 might be sent away from home to begin their working life in the household of another, departing the family roof to live among strangers, to labour and learn, and make their own way in the world. This early departure was not regarded as harsh or unusual, but as simply the normal course of things, the natural way that the young grew up. The reasons for this early leaving of home were various, rooted in the economic and social realities of the medieval world, in the need for the young to learn a trade or earn their keep, and in the customs that governed the raising of the young. Many children were sent away to serve in other households, working as servants and learning the skills of a trade or a craft, earning their keep and their training through their labour. This sending away of the young to serve in other households was extraordinarily common, so common that it has been said the medieval world was one in which a great many of the young spent their teenage years living and working not with their own families, but in the homes of others. The family home was, for many of the medieval young, something left behind at an early age, exchanged for the household of a master or an employer. This early departure from home meant that the medieval young grew up far more quickly and independently than we can easily imagine, thrust out into the world to fend for themselves at an age when we would think them in need of protection and care. Away from the shelter of their families, living and working among strangers, the medieval young learned early to stand on their own, to labour and endure, and make their way without the constant support of parents. This early independence, this early thrusting out into the world, shaped the whole character of medieval youth, breeding a self-reliance and a toughness born of necessity, but also, perhaps, a certain wildness, a freedom from the close supervision of the family that could lead the young into the excesses for which they were so often blamed. We should not imagine, however, that this early leaving of home was necessarily cruel or loveless, for it was simply the accepted way of things, and the young who left home to serve in other households were often taken into those households with a real measure of care, becoming part of a new domestic family under the authority of a master. The master of a household who took in young servants or apprentices assumed a real responsibility for them, a duty of care and discipline and instruction that made him something like a substitute parent. So while the medieval young left their own families young, they did not simply vanish into a friendless world, but passed into new households where they were, in the best cases, cared for and guided and taught. It was a different way of growing up, not necessarily a worse one, but certainly one that would astonish us in the earliness with which it thrust the young out of the family home. Let that surprising fact settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the great institution that shaped so many young lives, the world of apprenticeship. For a great many of the medieval young, and particularly for boys in the towns, the defining experience of their youth was apprenticeship, the long years of service and training under a master craftsman by which they learned a trade, and this institution shaped the lives of the young in ways both formative and often harsh. To understand medieval youth is to understand the world of apprenticeship, into which so many young people passed, and in which they spent the long years of their adolescence. Apprenticeship was the system by which the crafts and trades of the medieval town were passed on, by which a young person learned the skills of a craft through long years of service under a master who taught them the trade in exchange for their labour. A boy might be bound as an apprentice to a master craftsman for a term of many years, often 7 or more, during which he lived in the master's household, laboured in his workshop, and gradually learned the skills of the trade. This was a formal and binding arrangement, entered into by contract, that committed the young apprentice to years of service and the master to years of instruction, a serious undertaking that shaped the whole course of a young life. The apprentice years spanned much of what we would call the teenage years and beyond, the long formative stretch of youth, given over to the learning of a trade. The life of the apprentice was often hard, for he was bound to labour long hours at the work of the trade, subject to the authority and discipline of his master, and expected to endure the hardships and demands of his years of service. The apprentice worked long and hard, performing the labour of the workshop, learning the trade through toil, and submitting to the often strict discipline of the master who controlled his life. This was no easy apprenticeship in the modern sense, no gentle education, but a hard and demanding servitude, in which the young apprentice earned his training through years of labour and obedience. The hardships of the apprentice life were real, the discipline often severe, and the young who passed through it learned their trade through genuine toil and endurance. Yet apprenticeship was also a path to a future, a means by which the young could acquire the skills and the standing to make their way in the world, to become in time master craftsmen themselves, established and respected members of their trade. The years of hard service were an investment, purchasing the training and the qualification that would allow the former apprentice to practice his trade, to earn his living, and perhaps in time to rise to mastery and take on apprentices of his own. So the hardship of apprenticeship was endured in the hope of a future, the long years of service, the price of a place in the world of the trade. It was a hard road, but one that led, for those who completed it, to a real position and a real future. Apprenticeship also placed the young apprentice under the authority of a master who stood in the place of a parent, controlling not only his work, but much of his life, his conduct, and his discipline, and his moral instruction. The master was responsible for the apprentice's behavior, as well as his training, charged with keeping him in order and instructing him in right conduct, a substitute father who ruled the young apprentice's life. This authority was often resented by the spirited young, who chafed under the discipline and control, and the relationship between master and apprentice could be a difficult one, marked by the tension between the master's authority and the apprentice's youthful desire for freedom. It was, in this, a very recognizable relationship, the age-old tension between the older generation's discipline and the younger generation's restlessness, playing out in the workshops of the medieval town. Let that picture of the apprentice life settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the many young people who went into service in the households of others. Alongside apprenticeship, and even more widespread, was the institution of service, the sending of the young to labor as servants in the households of others. And this too was a defining experience of medieval youth, shaping the lives of a great many young people, both boys and girls, through the long years of their adolescence. Service was, for many, the ordinary experience of youth, the way they spent the years between childhood and full adulthood. Service meant going to live and work in the household of another, performing the labor of the home or the farm or the estate, in exchange for keep and wages and a place in the world. A great many of the medieval young, perhaps the majority in many places, spent their youth in service, living in the households of others and laboring at the endless work of the domestic and agricultural world. Girls as well as boys entered service, working as maidservants in the homes of others, and the sending of the young into service was so common that it formed one of the central experiences of medieval youth, a normal and expected stage of life through which a great many passed on their way to adulthood. Service was, in a sense, the ordinary lot of the medieval young, the common experience of the years we would call the teens. The life of the young servant was one of hard work and subordination, laboring at the demands of the household under the authority of a master and mistress, performing the endless tasks of the domestic and agricultural economy. The young servant worked hard and long at whatever labor the household required, subject to the authority and discipline of those they served, with little freedom and much toil. This was a hard life, a life of labor and subordination, in which the young learned to work and to endure and to submit to authority, earning their keep through their toil. Yet it was also, for many, a necessary stage on the road to adulthood, a means of earning a living and accumulating the small savings and the experience that would allow them, in time, to establish households of their own. Service was often a temporary stage of life, a phase through which the young passed on their way to marriage and the establishment of their own households, rather than a permanent condition. Many of the young entered service for a period of years, working and saving and gaining experience, before leaving service to marry and set up their own homes. This life cycle service, this passing of the young through a stage of service before establishing themselves as adults, was a characteristic feature of medieval society, a normal part of the passage from youth to adulthood. The years in service were, for many, the years of their youth, a stage to be passed through on the way to the fuller adulthood of marriage and an independent household. The widespread nature of service also meant that a great many of the medieval young lived, during their youth, not in their own family homes but in the households of others, among masters and mistresses and fellow servants rather than their own kin. This gave medieval youth a peculiarly independent and mobile character, the young often living away from home, moving between households in search of work and better conditions, forming their own relationships and communities apart from their families. The young in service were, in a sense, a class apart, living their own lives in the households of others, and this independence, this life apart from the family, was among the distinctive features of medieval youth, contributing to that freedom and that wildness for which the young were so often noted. Let that picture of the young in service settle gently in the dark. We turn now to those restless young who would not stay where they were placed, the runaways and wanderers who fled their masters and took to the road. Not all the young who were bound to a master or placed in service stayed contentedly where they were put, for many chafed against the discipline and the hardship of their condition and fled, running away from their masters, breaking their bonds, and taking to the road in search of freedom or better fortune. This restlessness of the young, this tendency to flee and to wander, was a real and troublesome feature of medieval youth, and it deserves our gentle attention. The apprentices and servants of the medieval world were bound to their masters by contract and custom, expected to serve out their terms, but many broke these bonds and ran away, fleeing the discipline or the hardship of their service before their terms were complete. A young apprentice, chafing under a harsh master or weary of the long years of his bond, might simply run away, abandoning his apprenticeship and taking to the road. A young servant, discontented with the conditions of service, might flee to seek better fortune elsewhere. This running away was a common enough occurrence that it was a real problem for masters, who might seek the return of their runaway apprentices and servants, and who regarded the flight of the young as a breach of the bonds that held society together. The runaway young were a familiar feature of the medieval world, a sign of the restlessness and the discontent of youth. Behind this running away lay the restlessness of the young, their chafing against discipline and hardship, their longing for freedom and better fortune, their willingness to take the risk of flight in pursuit of something better. The young who ran away were driven by the discontents and the longings of youth, by the desire to escape a harsh master or a hard condition, by the hope of finding better fortune elsewhere, by the restlessness that made them unwilling to endure what they found intolerable. This restlessness, this readiness to flee and to seek their fortune elsewhere, was a characteristic of the young, an expression of their energy and their boldness, and their unwillingness to be bound. The runaway young sought freedom and fortune on the road, driven by the restless energies of youth. The road drew the restless young with the promise of freedom and opportunity, and the towns in particular drew them with the hope of work and fortune and the excitement of urban life, so that the young drifted toward the towns in search of the opportunities they offered. The growing towns of the medieval world drew the restless young, offering work and wages and the excitement of urban life, and the young drifted toward them in search of fortune, swelling the population of the towns with the mobile and restless young. This drift of the young toward the towns, this seeking of fortune in the urban centres, was a significant feature of medieval life. The restless young drawn to the opportunities and excitements of the town. The town was the destination of many a runaway and wanderer, the place where the restless young sought their fortune. This mobility and restlessness of the young caused real concern to the authorities, who regarded the wandering and masterless young with suspicion, seeing in them a potential source of disorder and a threat to the settled order of society. The young who wandered without a master, who drifted from place to place in search of fortune, were regarded with suspicion by authorities who valued order and settlement, who saw in the masterless and mobile young a potential source of disorder and trouble. This suspicion of the wandering young, this concern about their mobility and their masterlessness, reflected the medieval valuing of order and settlement, and the anxiety that the restless young inspired. The runaways and wanderers were regarded as a troublesome and potentially dangerous element, their restlessness a threat to the settled order of society. And in their restless flight, their seeking of freedom and fortune on the road, we see once more the bold and restless energy of the medieval young, unwilling to be bound, ready to risk all in pursuit of something better. Let that restless picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the surprising matter of how young the medieval young could marry. We come now to a matter that will surprise many, and that we shall treat gently and soberly, the question of marriage and the medieval young. For the customs of the age regarding the marriage of young people differed in significant ways from our own, and formed an important part of the experience of medieval youth. We shall handle this with care and without any dwelling on delicate matters, treating it simply as the historical fact it is. The age at which people married in the medieval world varied considerably according to their station and their circumstances, but it is true that marriage could come earlier in life than is common in our own age, particularly among certain classes and in certain circumstances. Among the ordinary people, it should be said, marriage often came not so very early, for the young frequently had to spend years in service or apprenticeship, accumulating the means to establish a household before they could marry, so that marriage among the common folk might come only in the later years of youth or in early adulthood. But among the nobility and the propertied classes, where marriage was bound up with the transmission of property and the forging of alliances, it could come considerably earlier, arranged by families for their own advantage, and contracted when the young people were still quite young indeed. For the ordinary young people, then, marriage was often delayed by the practical necessity of establishing the means to support a household, and this delay shaped the whole experience of their youth. Because the young had to accumulate the resources to marry, through years of service or apprenticeship, marriage was often postponed until the accumulation was complete, so that the young of the common people might spend many years in the working, saving, unmarried state before they could establish households of their own. This gave the ordinary medieval young a long period of working youth before marriage, a stretch of years spent labouring and saving, during which they were neither children nor yet married adults, but young workers making their way toward the independence that marriage and a household represented. This long unmarried youth was, in itself, a distinctive feature of medieval life among the common people. Among the propertied and the noble, by contrast, the picture was different, for here marriage was often a matter of family strategy, arranged by parents to serve the interests of property and alliance, and contracted at ages that we would find far too young. The children of the wealthy and the powerful might be betrothed and married young, their unions arranged by their families to serve dynastic and economic purposes, the wishes of the young people themselves counting for little against the interests of the family. We shall not dwell on the particulars, but note simply that among the propertied classes, the marriage of the young could come early and be arranged for reasons quite apart from the affections of the young people involved, a matter of family strategy rather than personal choice. The whole understanding of marriage in the medieval world, indeed, differed from our own, for marriage was regarded less as a union of two individuals for love than as an arrangement serving the purposes of families and property and the ordering of society. The romantic idea of marriage as a freely chosen union of two people in love, so central to our own understanding, was not the primary understanding of the medieval world, where marriage served practical and social purposes, and where the choice of partner was often shaped or determined by families and circumstances, rather than by the free affection of the young. This different understanding of marriage shaped the experience of the young, whose unions were often matters of family and property rather than personal choice, and whose passage into married life was governed by considerations quite different from our own. Let that sober reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the wild reputation of the medieval young, and the unease with which their elders regarded them. We come now to the heart of our theme tonight, to the wildness for which the medieval young were so noted, and to the unease and disapproval with which the respectable elders of the age regarded their youth. For the medieval world, like every age, worried about its young people, regarding them as prone to wildness and folly and excess, and this ancient worry, This age-old disapproval of the young by their elders is one of the most striking and, in a way, most familiar features of medieval youth. The elders of the medieval world regarded the young with a mixture of tolerance and real unease, seeing in them a tendency to wildness and disorder, a boldness and a recklessness, and a passion that could lead them into trouble and that required to be watched and curbed. The young, in the medieval view, were prone to the excesses of their age, to rowdiness and drinking and fighting, to disorder and rebellion against authority, to all the follies and passions to which youth is subject. This view of the young as wild and troublesome, as prone to excess and disorder, was widespread in the medieval world, and it shaped the way the young were regarded and treated, watched with a wary eye by elders who worried about their conduct. It is a worry that will sound very familiar to us, for the complaint of the old about the wildness of the young is one of the most enduring in all of human history. It is worth noting how very old this complaint truly is, older even than the medieval world we are exploring. The grumbling of the settled and the mature about the boldness and the disrespect of the rising generation can be found in the writings of the ancient world, many centuries before the medieval age, and it can be heard just as loudly in our own. Every generation of elders seems to look upon the young who follow them and see a wildness, a disrespect, a want of the proper seriousness, that the elders are quite sure was not present in their own youth. The medieval elders were simply one more link in this very long chain of complaint, worrying about their young, precisely as their own elders had worried about them, and precisely as we worry about the young today. There is something almost comforting in the thought that this particular anxiety is so perfectly universal, so faithfully repeated in age after age, that it tells us less about the young of any particular time than about the enduring relationship between the generations. This wildness was not merely a matter of disapproving perception, for the medieval young truly did engage in behavior that alarmed their elders, gathering in boisterous bands, drinking and carousing, brawling and causing disorder, and generally living up to their wild reputation. The young of the medieval town and village really did gather together in their own boisterous groups, really did drink and fight and cause trouble, really did engage in the rowdy and disorderly behavior for which they were noted. This was not simply the disapproving imagination of anxious elders, but a real feature of medieval youth, the genuine wildness and boisterousness of the young, who, then as now, were prone to gather together and engage in the excesses of their age. The wild reputation of medieval youth was, in short, at least partly earned. Behind this wildness lay the particular circumstances of medieval youth, the early independence, the life away from the family, the hard labour balanced by boisterous release, the energies of the young finding their outlet in the gatherings and excesses that alarmed their elders. The young, thrust early into the world, living often away from the supervision of their families, labouring hard and seeking release in their leisure, gathered together and gave vent to their youthful energies in ways that could easily tip into disorder. The circumstances of medieval youth, in other words, were such as to encourage the very wildness for which the young were blamed, the early independence, and the freedom from family supervision, giving the young the opportunity for the excesses to which their age inclined them. The wildness of medieval youth grew naturally from the conditions of their lives, and yet this wildness was also, in its way, tolerated and even expected. For the medieval world, while it disapproved of the excesses of the young, also recognized that youth was a time of particular energies and passions, and made some allowance for the follies of the young. There was a certain acceptance of the idea that the young would be wild, that youth was a time of excess that would pass with maturity, and this acceptance tempered the disapproval with a measure of tolerance. The wildness of the young was disapproved of, but it was also, to some degree, expected and accepted as a natural, if regrettable, feature of youth, to be curbed where it grew too disorderly, but tolerated as an inevitable part of the passage through the reckless years of youth. It is, again, a very familiar attitude, this mixture of disapproval and resigned acceptance of the wildness of the young. Let that reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the boisterous bands in which the young gathered. One of the most striking features of medieval youth, and one that most alarmed the respectable elders of the age, was the tendency of the young to gather together in their own groups and bands, boisterous companies of young people who formed a distinct and often unruly presence in the life of the town and village. These youth groups were a characteristic feature of medieval society, and they deserve our gentle attention, for in them we see the young of the medieval world forming their own communities apart from their elders. The young of the medieval world, particularly the young men, commonly gathered together into groups and associations of their own, bands of youths who spent their leisure together, who shared in the pleasures and mischiefs of youth, and who formed a distinct social presence. These were not the organized clubs and teams of our own world, but looser and more boisterous gatherings, companies of young men bound together by their shared youth and their shared pursuit of pleasure and mischief. In these groups the young found companionship and identity, a place among their peers, a community of the young apart from the world of their elders. The gathering of the young into such bands was a natural expression of their youth, of their desire for the company of their own kind, and it was a common and characteristic feature of medieval life. In some places, these youth groups took on a more organized and formal character, becoming recognized associations of the young men of a community, with their own customs and roles and even a kind of authority within the life of the town or village. Such organized youth groups might take on certain recognized functions in the life of the community, particularly in the sphere of festivity and the policing of morals, of which we shall hear more. They gave the young a recognized place and role, a formal identity as a group within the community, even as they remained boisterous and sometimes unruly. These more organized youth associations reflected the recognition, in medieval society, of the young as a distinct group with their own place in the life of the community, even if that place was often a troublesome one. The activities of these youth bands were various, ranging from the innocent pleasures of shared leisure to the disorderly excesses that so alarmed their elders, from games and festivities to drinking and brawling and mischief. When the young gathered together, they sought the pleasures of their age, the games and the drinking, the festivities and the pranks. But their gatherings could also tip into the disorder and excess for which the young were noted, the brawling and the rowdiness, and the mischief that troubled the respectable. The youth bands were thus a source of both harmless pleasure and real disorder, the companionship of the young expressing itself in both innocent revelry and troublesome excess. It was in these bands, above all, that the wildness of medieval youth found its expression, the young egging one another on to the boldness and mischief that they might not have dared alone. There was, in these youth groups, something that we can readily recognize for the tendency of the young to gather together, to form their own communities and identities apart from their elders, to find in the company of their peers both pleasure and mischief, is a feature of youth in every age, including our own. The medieval youth band, for all its differences from the youth groups of our own world, reflects the same fundamental impulse, the desire of the young for the company of their own kind, the forming of a community of youth apart from the world of adults. In this, the medieval young were much like the young of every age, gathering together, finding identity and pleasure and mischief in their bands, living out the perennial sociability of youth. Let that picture of the youth bands settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the great occasions on which the wildness of the young was given free rein, the festivals of misrule. Among the most extraordinary features of medieval life, and one in which the wildness of the young found its fullest and most sanctioned expression, was the tradition of festive misrule, the great festivals and holidays on which the normal order of things was turned upside down, and license and revelry and disorder were, for a time, permitted and even celebrated. In these seasons of misrule, the young came into their own, and we shall wander through them gently, for they are among the most colourful and fascinating features of the medieval world. The medieval calendar was punctuated by festivals and holidays on which the ordinary rules of conduct were relaxed, and a spirit of revelry and license and inversion prevailed, when the normal order of society was, for a time, playfully overturned. On these occasions the usual restraints were loosened, and a season of feasting and revelry and disorder was permitted, a time of license in which the ordinary rules were suspended, and the world was, for a while, turned upside down. These festivals of misrule were an established and accepted part of medieval life, sanctioned occasions of revelry and inversion that provided a release from the ordinary discipline of society. They were times of celebration and excess, eagerly anticipated and enthusiastically observed. A characteristic feature of these festivals was the tradition of inversion, the playful overturning of the normal order, in which the low were raised up and the high brought down, and figures of mock authority, the lords of misrule and their like, presided over the revelry. During these festivals, a figure might be chosen to preside over the festivities as a mock ruler, a lord of misrule who reigned over the season of revelry, presiding over the inversion of the normal order and the license of the festival. This playful overturning of hierarchy, this temporary raising of the low and mocking of the high, was central to the spirit of misrule, a sanctioned inversion of the normal order that provided a release from its ordinary constraints. The world was, for the season of the festival, turned playfully upside down, and the young delighted in the inversion. In these festivals of misrule, the young played a central and enthusiastic part, for the license and revelry of the season gave free rein to the very energies and excesses that were ordinarily curbed, and the young threw themselves into the festivities with all the vigour of their age. The season of misrule was, in a sense, made for the young, offering a sanctioned outlet for their energies and their love of revelry, a time when their wildness could be given free expression within the accepted bounds of the festival. The young led and delighted in the revelry, the games and the feasting, the mockery and the disorder, giving vent to their youthful energies in the license of the season. In the festivals of misrule, the wildness of the young found not merely tolerance but celebration, a sanctioned release within the rhythms of the medieval year. There was a real social function to these festivals of misrule, for the sanctioned release they provided served to let off the pressures that built up under the ordinary discipline of society, allowing the energies and resentments that might otherwise have caused trouble to be vented harmlessly in the license of the festival. The season of misrule was, in this sense, a safety valve, a controlled release of the pressures of ordinary life, allowing the young and others to give vent to their energies and frustrations within the accepted bounds of the festival, and returning refreshed to the ordinary order when the season ended. This sanctioned inversion, this permitted season of license, served the stability of the ordinary order by providing a release from its constraints, a wisdom in the management of the energies of the young and the pressures of society. Let that colourful strangeness settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the rough and dangerous games in which the young delighted. The young of the medieval world delighted in games and sports, as the young of every age have done, but the games and sports of medieval youth were of a roughness and a wildness that would alarm us today, dangerous and violent pastimes that reflected the hardiness and the boldness of the medieval young. We shall wander through these gently, for they are among the more colourful and energetic features of medieval youth. The games of the medieval young were often rough and physical in the extreme, contests of strength and endurance and daring that could be genuinely dangerous, and that reflected a tolerance for physical risk, quite unlike our own careful modern attitudes. Where we surround the games of the young with rules and protections and careful supervision, the medieval young played games of a roughness and a danger that we would find alarming, contests in which injury was common and the risks were real. This roughness was simply accepted as part of the games, the danger tolerated as a normal feature of youthful sport. The young hardened to physical risk in a way that reflected the hardiness of their whole world. The games of medieval youth were not gentle pastimes, but rough and often dangerous contests. Among the most famous of these rough games was a wild form of football, utterly unlike our own organised sport, a chaotic and violent contest between large groups of young men that ranged across the countryside and left injury and disorder in its wake. This medieval football was a mass affair, a wild and unruly struggle between whole crowds of players, with few rules and much violence, ranging over fields and through villages in a chaotic contest that could cause real damage and injury. It was less a game in our sense than a sanctioned brawl, a rough and dangerous contest that gave vent to the energies and aggressions of the young, and that the authorities often viewed with alarm and sometimes sought to suppress. This wild football was among the most characteristic of the rough sports of medieval youth, a chaotic and violent pastime that reflected their hardiness and their tolerance for danger. Other rough sports and contests abounded as well: wrestling and fighting contests, games of strength and endurance and daring, all reflecting the same tolerance for physical risk and the same delight in rough physical contest. The young tested themselves against one another in contests of strength and skill and courage, in wrestling and other physical challenges, in games that could be genuinely dangerous and that reflected the value placed on physical prowess and hardiness. These rough contests were a central part of the recreational life of medieval youth, an outlet for their energies and a test of their prowess, conducted with a roughness and a tolerance for danger that would astonish our own more cautious age. The young delighted in these physical contests, in the testing of their strength and courage against their fellows. Behind this roughness lay a whole world of different attitudes toward physical risk and danger, a hardiness bred by the conditions of medieval life, in which injury and hardship were common, and the young were toughened early to the physical realities of a hard world. The medieval young, hardened by labour and the hardships of their lives, brought to their games the same toughness and tolerance for danger that marked their whole existence, playing rough because they lived rough, tolerating danger because danger was a familiar part of their lives. Their rough games were an expression of their hardiness, of the toughness bred by a hard world, and of the boldness and daring of youth given free rein in the contests of the field. It is a roughness that reflects the whole hard and hardy character of the medieval world, and of the young who grew up within it. Let that energetic strangeness settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the young and the alehouse, and the medieval love of drink. The alehouse was one of the central institutions of medieval social life, and the young, particularly the young men, were among its most enthusiastic patrons, for drink and the alehouse played a large part in the recreational life of medieval youth, contributing much to their wild reputation. We shall consider this gently, for it is among the more familiar of the ways in which the young of the medieval world sought their pleasure and release. Ale was the common drink of the medieval world, drunk by all, for the water could not be trusted, and ale was a staple of the diet as well as a pleasure, and the young drank it as everyone did, but with the particular enthusiasm and excess of their age. The alehouse, where ale was sold and the community gathered, was a natural resort of the young, a place of sociability and pleasure and release, where they could gather with their fellows, drink and talk and make merry, away from the labour of their work and the supervision of their elders. The young were drawn to the alehouse as a place of freedom and pleasure, a centre of their social life, where the companionship of youth could be enjoyed over the shared pleasure of drink. The drinking of the young could easily tip into excess, for the young, then as now, were prone to drink too much, and to the disorder and trouble that followed, and the drunkenness of the young was among the excesses for which they were noted and blamed. When the young gathered to drink, their drinking could become excessive, and the drunkenness that followed could lead to disorder, to brawling and mischief and trouble. the release of the alehouse tipping into the excess and disorder for which the young were noted. This youthful drinking and its consequences were a familiar feature of medieval life, the young giving vent to their energies and seeking their pleasure in drink, and sometimes carrying it to the excess that alarmed their elders and disturbed the peace. The drunkenness of the young was among the most familiar of their excesses. The alehouse was also a place where the young gathered in their bands, where the companionship of youth was cemented over shared drink, and where the boldness bred by drink could lead to the mischief and disorder that flowed from the gathering of the young. It was in the alehouse that the youth bands often gathered, that the shared pleasures and mischiefs of youth were pursued, that the boldness of drink emboldened the young to the excesses to which their age inclined them. The alehouse was thus a centre of the social life of the young, a place of companionship and pleasure that could also become a source of disorder, where the gathering of the young and the effects of drink combined to produce the wildness for which they were noted. The alehouse and the youth band went together, the one the natural resort of the other. Yet we should not imagine the alehouse merely as a den of youthful disorder, for it was also a genuine centre of community and sociability, a place of harmless pleasure and companionship, as well as of occasional excess. The alehouse served a real social function, providing a place for the community to gather, for news and talk to be exchanged, for the pleasures of companionship to be enjoyed, and the young shared in these harmless pleasures as much as in the occasional excesses. The drinking of the young was, for the most part, a harmless pleasure, a sociable release from the labour of their lives, that only sometimes tipped into the excess and disorder for which it was blamed. The alehouse was a place of pleasure and community, as well as of occasional trouble, and the young found in it the companionship and release that youth has always sought. Let that familiar picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now, gently and soberly, to the matter of youthful violence and brawling. We come now, gently and with a light touch, to the matter of youthful violence and quarrelling. For the young of the medieval world, particularly the young men, were prone to brawling and fighting in a way that formed part of their wild reputation and that reflected the rougher character of their age. We shall treat this soberly and without dwelling on anything grim, for it is the social pattern we wish to understand, rather than any violence itself. The young men of the medieval world lived in a rougher and more physically combative world than our own, in which quarrels were often settled with fists, in which fighting was a common feature of social life, and in which the young were particularly prone to the brawling and violence to which their age and their circumstances inclined them. Disputes among the young could easily turn to blows, and the brawling of young men was a common feature of medieval life, an ordinary, if disapproved of, part of the rough social world of the young. This proneness to fighting reflected both the general roughness of medieval life and the particular energies and passions of youth, the young quick to quarrel and quick to fight, in a world that was itself rougher and more violent than our own. Much of this fighting arose in the context of the alehouse and the festival and the gathering of the young, where drink and high spirits and the press of company could easily lead to quarrels and blows, the sociability of youth tipping into conflict. When the young gathered to drink and make merry, the combination of drink and high spirits and youthful pride could easily produce quarrels, and quarrels could easily turn to blows, so that the gatherings of the young were often the occasion of the brawling for which they were noted. This connection between the sociability of the young and their proneness to fighting was a familiar feature of medieval youth, the gatherings that provided companionship and pleasure also providing the occasion for conflict and violence. The brawl was, too often, the shadow side of the youthful gathering. Some of this youthful conflict was bound up with matters of honour and reputation, for the young men of the medieval world were keenly sensitive to their standing and their honour, quick to take offence, and quick to defend their reputation with their fists. In a world where personal honour and reputation mattered greatly, the young were quick to perceive slights and insults, and quick to defend their honour through fighting, so that questions of reputation and standing often lay behind the quarrels and brawls of the young. This sensitivity to honor, this readiness to fight in its defense, was a feature of the youthful culture of the age, bound up with the pride and the competitiveness of the young, and contributing to their proneness to violence and conflict. The defense of honor was a common occasion of youthful fighting. Behind all this lay the rougher and more violent character of the medieval world in general, a world less ordered and less policed than our own, in which violence was more common and more accepted, and in which the young naturally shared. The proneness of the young to violence was not simply a feature of their youth, but a reflection of the whole rougher character of their world, in which fighting was more common and more accepted, in which disputes were often settled by force, and in which the young were toughened early to a more violent way of life. Their brawling was an expression of the rougher world in which they lived, of a society less gentle and less ordered than our own, in which the young learned early the ways of a harder and more combative existence. It is a sobering reflection on how much gentler and more ordered our own world has, in this respect, become. Let that sober reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a strange and fascinating custom by which the young policed the morals of their community, the tradition of rough music. Among the more curious and fascinating of the customs associated with medieval youth was the tradition of rough music, the practice by which the young, and particularly the young men, took it upon themselves to police the morals and customs of their community through noisy public mockery and demonstration. This strange custom, in which the young acted as a kind of informal moral authority, is among the most interesting features of their world, and we shall wander through it gently. Rough music was the practice of subjecting those who had offended against the customs and morals of the community to a noisy, mocking public demonstration, a raucous serenade of discordant noise, jeering and ridicule, intended to shame the offender and express the community's disapproval. When someone had violated the accepted norms of the community, particularly in matters of marriage and domestic conduct, they might be subjected to this rough music, a cacophony of banging pots and pans, jeering and mockery, performed outside their home by a crowd, often of the young, to express the community's censure. This noisy public shaming was a recognized custom, a way in which the community, through its young men in particular, expressed its disapproval of those who had offended against its norms. It was a form of popular justice, informal and raucous, by which the community policed its own morals. The young men of the community were often the principal performers of this rough music, taking upon themselves the role of enforcers of the community's morals, a role that gave their energies and their love of noise and disorder a sanctioned and even useful outlet. In performing the rough music, the young men acted as a kind of informal moral police, expressing and enforcing the community's norms through their noisy demonstrations, their youthful energies channeled into the policing of morals. This gave the young a recognized social role, a sanctioned outlet for their love of noise and disorder and mischief, even as it served the community's interest in enforcing its norms. The rough music was thus a curious combination of youthful mischief and social function, the energies of the young serving the moral order of the community. The occasions for rough music were various, but they often centered on offenses against the customs of marriage and domestic life, on unions regarded as improper, or on conduct within marriage that violated the community's norms. Marriages that offended the community's sense of propriety, or domestic arrangements regarded as improper, might attract the rough music, the community expressing through its noisy demonstration its disapproval of the offending union or conduct. This policing of marriage and domestic morals was among the principal functions of the rough music, the community, through its young men, enforcing its norms regarding these central matters of social life. The rough music was, in this sense, a guardian of the community's customs, a means of expressing and enforcing its sense of proper conduct. There is something both strange and recognizable in this custom, in the young taking upon themselves the role of moral enforcers, channeling their energies and their love of mischief into the noisy policing of their community's norms. It reflects the recognized place of the young in medieval society, their role not merely as troublesome wild things, but as participants in the life and the moral order of the community, with a sanctioned role to play. And it reflects, too, the way in which the energies of the young could be channeled into useful social functions, their love of noise and disorder given a constructive outlet in the policing of morals. The rough music is a fascinating instance of the complex place of the young in medieval society, at once wild and disorderly, and yet also, in their way, guardians of the community's customs. Let that curious strangeness settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a particularly wild group of the medieval young, the students and scholars. If there was one group of the medieval young whose wildness was most notorious, it was the students, the young scholars of the medieval universities, whose riotous and disorderly conduct became legendary, and who gave the respectable citizens of the university towns a great deal of trouble. The wild student is one of the most colourful figures of medieval youth, and we shall wander through his world with gentle amusement. The medieval universities gathered together large numbers of young men, students who came to study, but who also, being young and gathered together, and often far from home and family, engaged in the riotous and disorderly conduct for which students became so notorious. These young scholars, freed from the supervision of their families and gathered together in large numbers, gave vent to their youthful energies in drinking and brawling and mischief of every kind, earning a reputation for wildness that became legendary. The medieval student was famous for his riotous living, his drinking and carousing and disorderly conduct, his tendency to trouble and mischief, a reputation that the students seem often to have richly earned. The universities were centres of learning, but they were also centres of youthful disorder, the young scholars, as noted for their wildness as for their studies. A particular feature of student life was the frequent conflict between the students and the ordinary citizens of the university towns, the famous tension between town and gown that could erupt into real disorder and violence. The students, with their privileges and their arrogance and their wildness, often came into conflict with the townspeople, and these conflicts could escalate into serious disorder, into brawls and riots between the students and the citizens. This tension between town and gown was a chronic feature of medieval university life, the students and the townspeople at odds, their conflict sometimes erupting into real violence and disorder. The wild students were a source of real trouble to the towns that housed them, their disorderly conduct, and their conflicts with the citizens, a chronic disturbance of the peace. The students were also notorious for their drinking, their gambling, their pursuit of pleasure and mischief, living lives of riotous indulgence that scandalized the respectable and that formed the substance of their legendary reputation. Freed from supervision and gathered together in the pursuit of learning, the students devoted no small part of their energies to the pursuit of pleasure, drinking and gambling and carousing, engaging in the mischief and excess for which they became famous. This riotous living was a defining feature of the medieval student, whose pursuit of pleasure and mischief often seemed to rival his pursuit of learning, and whose wild reputation became one of the enduring images of medieval youth. The student's life was one of study, certainly, but also of riotous indulgence and disorder. Behind the wildness of the students lay the same circumstances that produced the wildness of medieval youth in general: the freedom from family supervision, the gathering together of the young, the energies of youth seeking their outlet in pleasure and mischief. The students were simply medieval youth in a particularly concentrated and privileged form, gathered together in large numbers, freed from supervision, possessed of privileges and energies that found their outlet in the riotous living for which they became famous. Their wildness was the wildness of youth, given particular scope and freedom, the energies of the young concentrated and unleashed in the university towns. And in their riotous living we see, in a particularly vivid form, the perennial wildness of the young, the same energies and excesses that mark youth in every age, given free rein in the medieval universities. Let that colourful picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now, gently and with care, to the distinct experience of the young women of the medieval world. Thus far we have spoken much of the young men, whose wildness was most noted and most troublesome. But the young women of the medieval world had their own distinct experience of youth, shaped by the particular expectations and constraints placed upon their sex, and we shall consider their world gently and with respect. The experience of the young woman differed in important ways from that of the young man, and it forms an essential part of the picture of medieval youth. The young women of the medieval world, like the young men, often left home to work in service, labouring as maidservants in the households of others, and passing their youth in the working, subordinate condition of the servant. Girls as well as boys entered service, and many young women spent their youth labouring in the households of others, performing the domestic work of the medieval world, earning their keep and accumulating the small savings that might allow them, in time, to marry and establish households of their own. The young woman in service shared much of the experience of her male counterpart, the hard work, the subordination, the life away from her own family, the passage through a stage of service on the way to adulthood. Service was, for young women as for young men, a common experience of medieval youth. Yet the young woman's experience was shaped by the particular expectations placed upon her sex, by the constraints and the dangers and the different standards that governed the lives of women in the medieval world. The young woman was held to different standards of conduct than the young man, her reputation and her virtue guarded and valued in ways that constrained her freedom, her life more closely watched and more sharply judged. Where the wildness of the young man was tolerated and even expected, the young woman was held to stricter standards, her conduct more closely governed, her reputation more carefully guarded. This double standard, this different set of expectations for young men and young women, shaped the whole experience of the young woman, constraining her freedom and subjecting her to a closer supervision and a sharper judgment than her male counterpart. The great expectation placed upon the young woman was that she would in time marry and establish a household, and much of her youth was, in a sense, a preparation for this expected destiny, a matter of acquiring the skills and the reputation and the means that would allow her to make a good marriage. The young woman was expected to learn the skills of the household, to guard her reputation, to prepare herself for the marriage that was her expected destiny, and her youth was shaped by this expectation. The accumulation of a dowry, the learning of domestic skills, the guarding of reputation, all served the end of marriage, toward which the young woman's whole youth was, in a sense, directed. This expectation shaped her experience of youth, directing it toward the marriage and the household that were held to be her proper destiny. And yet, within these constraints, the young women of the medieval world lived full and various lives, working and earning, forming friendships and relationships, participating in the festivities and the social life of their communities, exercising what freedom and agency their world allowed. We should not imagine the young woman merely as a constrained and passive figure, for she too shared in the life and the pleasures of youth, in the festivities and the gatherings and the relationships that filled the lives of the young. Within the constraints placed upon her, the young woman found room for friendship and pleasure and agency, living a full if circumscribed youth, sharing in the social life of her community and exercising what freedom her world allowed. The young women of the medieval world were not merely victims of their constraints, but active participants in the life of their age, living their youth as fully as their world permitted. Let that reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the matter of youthful love and courtship. The young of the medieval world, like the young of every age, felt the stirrings of love and attraction, and the customs of courtship by which they pursued these feelings form a gentle and fascinating part of the picture of medieval youth. We shall wander through this delicately and with a light touch, for it is among the more tender and universal of the experiences of the young. The young of the medieval world fell in love and felt attraction as the young always have, and despite the constraints placed upon them and the practical considerations that governed marriage, the affections of the young found expression in the customs of courtship and the pursuit of love. However much marriage might be governed by practical considerations and family strategy, the young still felt the stirrings of the heart, still formed attachments and pursued affections, still knew the loves and longings of youth. These feelings found expression in the courtship customs of the age, in the ways the young pursued and expressed their affections, in the tokens and gestures and meetings by which love was conducted. The young of the medieval world knew love as the young always have, and pursued it in the customs of their age. Courtship among the ordinary young often had a considerable freedom, particularly among the common people, where the young frequently had more say in the choice of their partners than the constraints of the propertied classes allowed. Among the common folk, where marriage was less bound up with property and family strategy, the young often had real freedom to choose their partners, to court and be courted, to form attachments based on their own affections. This freedom of courtship among the common people meant that the young often married for love, or at least with real say in the choice of their partners, pursuing their affections in the customs of courtship, and choosing their partners with a freedom that the propertied classes did not allow. The common young enjoyed a real liberty in matters of the heart, courting and choosing with considerable freedom. The customs of courtship were various, involving the exchange of tokens and gifts, the meetings and gatherings at which the young could meet and form attachments, the gestures and expressions by which affection was conveyed. The young met and courted at the festivals and gatherings and social occasions of their communities, exchanged tokens of affection, conveyed their feelings through the customary gestures and expressions of courtship. These customs gave shape to the pursuit of love, providing the occasions and the means by which the young could meet and court and form attachments, the framework within which the affections of youth were pursued. The courtship customs of the medieval world were the medium through which the young expressed and pursued their loves, a gentle and fascinating aspect of their experience. There is something deeply universal and recognizable in this pursuit of love by the medieval young, in their fallings in love and their courtships, their tokens and gestures and longings, for the experience of young love is one that connects the young of every age. However different the customs and constraints of the medieval world, the young felt the same stirrings of the heart that the young have always felt, pursued the same loves and longings, knew the same joys and sorrows of young affection. In their loves and courtships, the medieval young were much like the young of every age, feeling the universal experience of young love, pursuing the affections that have always stirred the hearts of the young. It is a tender and universal thread that connects them to us, this experience of young love, reminding us of the common humanity that binds the young across all the ages. Let that tender reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the young who trained for war, the pages and squires of the knightly world. Among the noble young, a particular path of youth led toward the world of arms and chivalry. The long training by which a boy of noble birth was made into a knight, passing through the stages of page and squire, before attaining the knighthood that was his destiny. This training of the young warrior is among the most colourful features of medieval youth, and we shall wander through it gently. The boy of noble birth, destined for knighthood, began his training young, sent away from home like other medieval children, but to serve in the household of a lord, where he would learn the arts of chivalry and war. Such a boy would be sent, often around the age of 7, to the household of a lord, where he began his service as a page, learning the manners and skills of the noble world, the beginnings of the long training that would lead toward knighthood. This early sending away, this beginning of the training young, mirrored the early departure from home of other medieval children, but directed toward the particular destiny of the noble warrior. The making of a knight began in childhood, with the boy's entry into the household of a lord as a page. As a page, the young boy learned the manners and accomplishments of the noble world, serving in the household, learning courtesy and the beginnings of the skills of arms, and being formed in the ways of chivalry. The page served the lord and lady of the household, learned the manners and courtesies of noble life, began to acquire the skills of horsemanship and arms, and was formed in the values and accomplishments of the chivalric world. This was the first stage of the long training, the boy learning the ways of the noble world through service and instruction, being shaped toward the knighthood that lay ahead. The years as a page were the foundation of the knightly training, the boy formed in the manners and beginnings of the skills of the noble warrior. As the boy grew older, he advanced to the stage of squire, taking on a more direct role in the world of arms, serving a knight, tending his arms and horses, and learning through closer involvement the skills and the practice of war. The squire served a knight directly, attending him, caring for his arms and horses, accompanying him, and learning through this close service the skills and the conduct of the knightly warrior. This was a more advanced stage of the training, the young man now closely involved in the world of arms, learning the practice of war through his service to a knight, being prepared for the knighthood that now lay within reach. The squire was a warrior in training, learning his trade through service to a master of arms, advancing toward the knighthood that was his goal. The culmination of this long training was the attainment of knighthood itself, the ceremony by which the young man, his training complete, was made a knight and took his place among the warriors of the noble world. After his long years of training as page and squire, the young man might at last be made a knight, admitted through the ceremony of knighting to the ranks of the chivalric warriors, his training complete and his destiny attained. This was the goal toward which the whole long training had been directed, the making of the noble boy into the knightly warrior, and its attainment marked the young man's entry into the full estate of the noble warrior. The making of a knight was thus a long process, beginning in childhood and culminating in the knighthood that was the destiny of the noble young, a distinctive path of youth for those born to the world of arms. Let that colourful picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the play and the pastimes in which the medieval young delighted. For all the hardship and the early responsibility of medieval youth, the young still found time for play and pleasure, for the pastimes and revelries in which the young of every age delight, and these lighter aspects of their lives form a gentle and cheering part of our picture of medieval youth. We shall wander through them with pleasure, for they remind us that the young of the medieval world, for all their hardships, still knew the joys of youth. The young of the medieval world delighted in a great variety of games and pastimes, from the rough sports we have already considered to gentler games and amusements, filling their leisure with the play and pleasure that youth has always sought. Beyond the rough contests of the field, the young enjoyed many gentler games and amusements, games of skill and chance, the play and pastimes that filled the leisure hours of the young. These games and amusements were a cheering part of the lives of the young, an outlet for their energies, and a source of pleasure and companionship, filling the leisure that even their hard lives allowed. The young found in their games and pastimes the pleasure and play that youth has always sought, a bright thread in the fabric of their lives. Music and dancing were among the great pleasures of the medieval young, who delighted in the songs and dances of their age, filling their festivities and gatherings with music and movement and revelry. The young loved to sing and to dance, and music and dancing were central to the festivities and gatherings in which they delighted, the young giving vent to their energies and their joy in the revelry of song and dance. These pleasures of music and dance were a central part of the recreational life of the young, an expression of their joy and energy, filling their gatherings with revelry and delight. The young of the medieval world danced and sang as the young have always done, finding in music and movement a joyful outlet for their energies and their high spirits. The festivals and holidays of the medieval year provided the great occasions for the play and revelry of the young, the sanctioned times of celebration in which they could give free rein to their love of pleasure and festivity. We have already considered the festivals of misrule, but all the many festivals and holidays of the medieval year were occasions of celebration and revelry in which the young delighted, times of feasting and dancing and games and pleasure. These festive occasions were the high points of the recreational life of the young, the sanctioned times when they could set aside their labour and give themselves to celebration and revelry. The young looked forward to and delighted in these festivals, the bright occasions of pleasure and festivity that punctuated the labour of their lives. There is something cheering and gentle in this picture of the medieval young at play, in their games and their music and their dancing, their festivals and their revelries, for it reminds us that their lives, hard as they were, still held real joy and pleasure. The young of the medieval world worked hard and bore early responsibilities, but they also played and sang and danced and celebrated, finding the joys of youth amid the hardships of their lives. Their play and their revelry remind us of their fundamental humanity, of the joy and pleasure that youth has always found, of the brightness that filled their lives alongside the hardship. It is a cheering thought, this picture of the medieval young at their play, a reminder that youth has always found its joys, in every age and every condition. Let that cheering picture settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the young and the church, and the place of religion in their lives. The church was the great presence that pervaded all of medieval life, and the young were shaped by it as everyone was, receiving from it their moral instruction and their religious formation, and standing in a particular and sometimes tense relationship with its authority. The place of the church in the lives of the young forms an important part of our picture, and we shall consider it gently. The church was responsible for much of the moral and religious instruction of the young, teaching them the beliefs and the moral rules of their faith, shaping their consciences and their conduct, forming them in the religion that pervaded their world. Through its teaching and its rituals, the church instructed the young in the beliefs and the moral demands of their faith, sought to shape their conduct and their consciences, and formed them in the religious understanding that governed the medieval world. This religious formation was a central part of the upbringing of the young, the church seeking to shape them into good Christians, to instill in them the beliefs and the moral rules of their faith. The young were formed by the church as everyone was, receiving from it the religious understanding that shaped their world. Yet the relationship between the young and the church could be a tense one, for the wildness and the excesses of the young often ran counter to the moral demands of the church, and the young frequently fell short of the standards the church set for them. The church demanded a moral conduct that the wildness of the young often violated, and the excesses for which the young were noted, the drinking and brawling and disorder, ran counter to the moral standards the church sought to enforce. This created a tension between the young and the church, the moral demands of the one at odds with the wildness of the other, the young often falling short of the standards the church set. The church regarded the excesses of the young with disapproval, seeking to curb their wildness and enforce its moral demands, and the young often chafed against its constraints. The church also provided, however, a path of religious devotion and even vocation for some of the young, who found in religion a genuine calling, entering the religious life or devoting themselves to the faith with real fervour. For some of the young, religion was not a constraint to be chafed against, but a genuine calling, a path of devotion and even vocation. And such young people might enter the religious life, becoming monks or nuns, or devote themselves to their faith with real fervour and sincerity. The church thus offered the young not only moral instruction and constraint, but also a path of genuine devotion, a calling that some embraced with real fervour. The religious life drew some of the young, who found in it a genuine vocation, a devotion that shaped their youth and their lives. The place of the church in the lives of the young was thus a complex one, at once a source of moral instruction and constraint, a demanding authority against which the wildness of the young often chafed, and a path of genuine devotion that some embraced. The young stood in a varied relationship with the church, formed by its instruction, constrained by its demands, sometimes chafing against its authority, sometimes embracing its devotion. This complex relationship reflected the pervasive presence of the church in medieval life, shaping the young as it shaped everyone, and standing in a particular relationship with the energies and excesses of youth. The church was a central presence in the lives of the medieval young, forming and constraining, and sometimes calling them, a defining feature of their world. Let that reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the part the young played in the disorders and rebellions of their age. The young, with their energies and their boldness and their proneness to disorder, often played a prominent part in the wider disturbances and rebellions of the medieval world, contributing their vigour to the disorders and uprisings that periodically shook the age. We shall consider this soberly and gently, for it is the social pattern we wish to understand rather than any violence. The young, being bold and energetic and less bound by the caution of their elders, often played a prominent part in the popular disturbances and rebellions of the medieval world, their vigour and their boldness contributing to the disorders that periodically arose. When the people rose in protest or rebellion, the young were often at the forefront, their energy and their boldness and their lesser caution making them prominent in the disturbances. This prominence of the young in popular disorder was a recurring feature of medieval life, the energies of youth contributing to the uprisings and disturbances that periodically shook the age. The young, with their boldness and their vigour, were often the most active participants in these disorders, their youthful energies given a dangerous outlet in rebellion and protest. This prominence of the young in disorder flowed naturally from the character of youth, from the boldness and the energy and the willingness to take risks that marked the young and that made them ready participants in the disturbances of their age. The young were bolder than their elders, more willing to take risks, more easily roused to action, and these qualities made them prominent in the popular disorders, the vigour of youth lending force to rebellion and protest. This was simply the character of youth given a particular outlet, the boldness and energy of the young expressing itself in the disturbances of the age. The young brought to rebellion the same energies and boldness that marked their whole conduct, their youthful vigour making them prominent in the disorders of their world. The authorities, for their part, regarded the young with particular wariness as potential sources of disorder, watching them as a group prone to disturbance and rebellion, and seeking to control and curb their dangerous energies. Aware of the prominence of the young in disorder, the authorities regarded them with suspicion and wariness, seeing in them a potential source of disturbance that required to be watched and controlled. This wariness of the young as potential troublemakers, as a group prone to disorder, shaped the way they were regarded and treated by those in authority, who sought to curb their energies and prevent their disorder. The young were watched as a potentially dangerous group, their energies regarded as a threat to order that required to be controlled. Yet the involvement of the young in disorder was also, in a sense, an expression of their engagement with the life of their world, of their participation in the struggles and grievances of their communities, and not merely of a mindless wildness. When the young took part in rebellion and protest, they were often engaging with real grievances, participating in the struggles of their communities, giving voice and force to real discontents. Their involvement in disorder was thus not merely wildness but engagement, the young participating in the life and struggles of their world, bringing their energies to the causes and grievances of their communities. This was a more serious and meaningful aspect of the wildness of the young, their energies given not merely to mischief but to the real struggles of their age. Let that sober reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the deeper fear that the young inspired in their elders. Behind all the disapproval and the wariness with which the medieval world regarded its young, there lay something deeper, a real fear of the young, of their energies and their numbers and their potential for disorder. a fear that shaped the way they were regarded and treated. This fear of the young is a fascinating and revealing feature of the medieval world, and we shall consider it gently. The medieval world regarded the young not merely with disapproval, but with a real element of fear, seeing in them a potentially dangerous force, a source of disorder and disruption that threatened the stability of society. The energies of the young, their numbers, their boldness, their proneness to disorder, made them appear to their elders as a potentially dangerous force, a threat to the ordered stability of society that required to be watched and controlled. This fear of the young shaped the way they were regarded, coloured the disapproval of their elders with a real anxiety, and lay behind the efforts to control and curb their energies. The young were feared as well as disapproved of, seen as a potential threat to the order of society. This fear reflected real concerns about the disruptive potential of the young, about the disorder they could cause, the rebellions in which they might take part, the threat their ungoverned energies might pose to the stability of the social order. The medieval world, valuing order and stability, saw in the ungoverned energies of the young a real threat, a potential for disorder and disruption that could undermine the stability it prized. This was not merely an irrational prejudice, but a response to the real disruptive potential of the young, to their prominence in disorder and their capacity for disruption. The fear of the young reflected genuine concerns about the threat their energies posed to the ordered stability of medieval society. The response to this fear was the effort to control and curb the young, to channel their energies into acceptable outlets, to subject them to discipline and supervision, to contain the threat they were felt to pose. Society sought to control the young through the discipline of apprenticeship and service, through the authority of masters and elders, through the moral instruction of the church, through all the mechanisms by which the energies of the young were curbed and channeled. These efforts to control the young reflected the fear they inspired, the perceived need to contain their dangerous energies and prevent the disorder they might cause. The whole apparatus of discipline and supervision to which the young were subject was, in part, a response to the fear they inspired, an effort to contain and control the threat they were felt to pose. There is something very recognizable in this fear of the young, in the anxiety of the old about the energies and the potential disorder of the young, for it is a fear that has recurred in every age, including our own. The complaint and the fear of the old about the young, the anxiety about their wildness and their potential for disorder, the effort to control and curb them, are among the most enduring features of human society, recurring in age after age. The medieval fear of the young was simply one instance of this perennial anxiety, the age-old worry of the established about the rising generation, the fear of the energies and the potential disorder of youth. In this fear, as in so much else, the medieval world was much like our own, and its anxiety about the young connects it to the anxieties of every age. Let that reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the hard burden that the medieval young bore, of growing up so very fast. For all the wildness and the revelry we have explored, we should not forget the hard burden that lay at the heart of medieval youth, the early and heavy responsibility that the young were made to bear, the growing up too fast that was the lot of the medieval young. This is the sober truth beneath the wildness, and we shall consider it gently, for it deserves our sympathy and understanding. The medieval young, as we have seen, were thrust early into the world of adult labour and responsibility, leaving home young, working hard, bearing burdens that we would think far too heavy for their years. The early leaving of home, the hard labour of apprenticeship and service, the early entry into the world of adult work, all meant that the medieval young grew up fast, taking on the responsibilities and burdens of adult life at an age when we would think them still children. This early maturity, this heavy burden of responsibility born young, was the sober reality beneath the wildness of medieval youth, the hard truth of their early entry into the adult world. The medieval young bore burdens and responsibilities that would astonish us. growing up far faster than the young of our own protected age. This early burden meant that the medieval young were denied the long, protected, carefree youth that we regard as the birthright of the young, thrust instead into hardship and labour and responsibility while still very young, where we surround our young with protection and care, allowing them a long and sheltered youth. The medieval young were given no such shelter, but were made to labour and to bear responsibility while still children by our reckoning. This denial of a protected youth, this early thrusting into hardship and responsibility, was the hard lot of the medieval young, who grew up fast because their world required it of them. They were denied the carefree youth we regard as natural, made instead to bear the burdens of adulthood while still young. The wildness of the young, indeed, may be understood in part as a response to this hard burden, as a release from the pressures of their early responsibility, a giving vent to the energies that their hard lives otherwise suppressed. The revelry and the excess of the young, their drinking and their gathering and their disorder, may be seen in part as a release from the hard burden of their lives, an outlet for the energies suppressed by their labour and responsibility. Their wildness was, in this sense, the other side of their hard lives, the release that balanced the burden, the giving vent to energies that their hard labour otherwise contained. The wildness and the hardship of medieval youth were thus two sides of the same coin, the release and the burden together, the revelry a response to the weight of early responsibility. There is something poignant in this picture of the medieval young, bearing their heavy burdens so young, denied the sheltered youth we regard as natural, snatching their wild pleasures as a release from the weight of their early responsibility. It calls forth our sympathy, this early maturity, this heavy burden borne by the young, and it deepens our understanding of their wildness, which we may now see not merely as reckless excess, but as the release of the hard-pressed young. The medieval young grew up too fast, bearing burdens too heavy for their years, and their wildness was in part a response to this hard lot, a snatching of pleasure and release amid the weight of their responsibilities. It is a poignant and sympathetic picture, this hard youth and its wild release. Let that sober reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to reflect on what we share with the medieval young across the centuries. Beneath all the wildness and revelry, the fundamental reality of medieval youth was labour, the hard work that the young were made to perform from an early age. For the medieval young were, above all, workers, contributing their labour to the economy of the household and the community from a very young age indeed. This labour was the foundation of their lives, and we shall consider it gently, for it deserves our recognition. The young of the medieval world worked, and worked hard, from an age that would astonish us, contributing their labour to the household and the farm and the workshop from early childhood, and bearing a real share of the work of their world. Children began to work young, taking on tasks suited to their age and growing into heavier labour as they grew, so that by the time they reached the years we call the teens, they were often full workers, bearing a real share of the labour of their world. This early labour was simply the normal expectation, the young contributing their work as a matter of course, growing into the full labour of adulthood through a childhood and youth of increasing toil. The medieval young were workers from an early age, their labour a fundamental part of their lives and of the economy of their world. The labour of the young took many forms, from the domestic and agricultural work of the countryside to the craft labour of the town, from the tasks of the household to the work of the fields and the workshops. In the countryside, the young laboured at the endless work of the farm, tending animals, working the fields, performing the countless tasks of the agricultural world. In the town, they laboured in the workshops and households, at the craft work and the domestic work of the urban economy. Whatever their setting, the young contributed their labour, performing the work suited to their age and strength, bearing their share of the toil of their world. The labour of the young was various but universal, a fundamental feature of their lives, whatever their setting or station. This early and heavy labor reflected the hard economic realities of the medieval world, in which every hand was needed, in which the labor of the young was essential to the survival of households living close to the edge, in which there was no room for a long, idle youth. The medieval world could not afford to keep its young in idleness, for the labor of every member was needed for survival, and the young were put to work early because their work was needed. This economic necessity underlay the early labor of the young, the hard reality that their work was essential, that households living close to the edge of survival needed the contribution of every hand. The labor of the young was not cruelty but necessity, the hard requirement of a world in which survival demanded the work of all. Yet this labor also had its value for the young themselves, teaching them the skills of their world, forming them into capable workers, preparing them for the adult lives they would lead. Through their labor, the young learned the skills they would need, were formed into capable and competent workers, and were prepared for the adult roles they would take up. The labor of youth was, in this sense, an education, a forming of the young into the workers and adults they would become, a preparation for the lives that lay ahead. Hard as it was, the labor of the young had its value, teaching them their skills and forming them for their adult lives. It was the foundation of their youth, the hard work that underlay all the wildness and revelry, the fundamental reality of the lives of the medieval young. Let that sober reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the thresholds by which the young passed into the fuller state of adulthood. The passage from youth to adulthood in the medieval world was marked by various thresholds and transitions, the points at which the young were recognized as having attained the fuller state of adulthood, and these markers of coming of age form an interesting part of our picture of medieval youth. We shall consider them gently, for they reveal how the medieval world understood the passage from youth to maturity. The medieval world recognized various thresholds by which the young passed into adulthood, points at which they attained the rights and responsibilities of the adult estate, though these varied according to station and circumstance, and were less sharply defined than our own markers of adulthood. There was no single moment of coming of age in the medieval world, no one threshold that all crossed, but various transitions and markers that differed according to a person's station and circumstances. For some, the completion of an apprenticeship marked the passage to adult standing. For others, marriage and the establishment of a household. For the noble, the attainment of knighthood or the inheritance of property. These various thresholds marked the passage from youth to adulthood, the points at which the young attained the fuller state of the adult. For many of the common young, the great marker of adulthood was marriage and the establishment of an independent household, the point at which the young person left behind the subordinate condition of youth and became an independent adult, a householder in their own right. Marriage and the setting up of a household marked, for many, the true passage to adulthood, the point at which the young person ceased to be a subordinate youth, a servant or apprentice or dependent, and became an independent adult with a household of their own. This was the great transition, the passage from the subordinate condition of youth to the independent estate of the adult householder, and it marked the true coming of age for many of the common people. The establishment of an independent household was the mark of full adulthood. For those in apprenticeship or service, the completion of their term marked an important transition, the passage from the subordinate condition of the apprentice or servant to the fuller standing of the qualified adult. The completion of an apprenticeship, the attainment of the freedom of a trade, marked the passage from the subordinate condition of the apprentice to the fuller standing of the master craftsman, an important marker of coming of age for those who followed this path. Similarly, the passage out of service into independent adulthood marked a transition to fuller standing. These completions of terms of service and apprenticeship marked important thresholds in the passage to adulthood, the points at which the young attained the fuller standing of qualified and independent adults. The medieval markers of coming of age were thus various and often gradual, The passage from youth to adulthood, marked not by a single threshold, but by a series of transitions, differing according to station and circumstance. This gradual and various passage reflected the medieval understanding of the life course, in which the transition from youth to adulthood was a matter of attaining the various markers of adult standing, the household, the trade, the property, the recognition of full adult status. The coming of age was thus a process rather than a moment, a gradual attainment of the markers and responsibilities of adulthood, differing for different people according to their station and path. It marked the end of the youth we have explored tonight, the passage of the wild young into the settled estate of the adult. Let that reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to reflect on what we share with the medieval young across all the centuries that divide us. Having wandered through the strange and wild world of medieval youth, we may pause now to reflect on how much, for all the differences, we share with the young of that distant age, on the deep continuities of youth that connect the medieval young to the young of every age, including our own. This is a gentle and heartening reflection, and a fitting one as we near the end of our journey. For all the vast differences between their world and ours, the medieval young were, at bottom, young people much like the young of every age, possessed of the same energies and passions, the same boldness and folly, the same joys and troubles of youth. Beneath all the differences of custom and circumstance, the fundamental character of youth was the same energies seeking their outlet, the same passions stirring the heart, the same boldness and recklessness and joy that mark the young in every age. The medieval young gathered together, sought pleasure and adventure, chafed against authority, fell in love, made mischief and trouble, as the young have always done. In all this, they were much like the young of our own age, sharing the deep and enduring character of youth. The complaint of the old about the young, indeed, connects the medieval world to our own with a particular directness. For the anxiety of the medieval elders about the wildness of their young is precisely the anxiety that every generation of elders has felt about the young who follow them. The worry about the wildness of the young, the disapproval of their excesses, the fear of their disorder, the sense that the young are wilder and more troublesome than they ought to be, are among the most enduring of human attitudes, recurring in age after age. The medieval elders worried about their young precisely as elders have always worried, and their complaints sound remarkably like the complaints of every age, including our own. In this perennial anxiety of the old about the young, the medieval world speaks directly to us, and the deep experiences of youth, the falling in love, the seeking of independence, the gathering with one's fellows, the chafing against authority, the snatching of pleasure and adventure, connect the medieval young to the young of every age in the most fundamental way. These experiences, the great universal experiences of youth, were as real for the medieval young as they are for the young of our own age, connecting them to us across the centuries through the shared experience of being young. However different the customs and circumstances, the young of the medieval world knew the same fundamental experiences of youth that the young know now, the same loves and longings and rebellions and joys. In these shared experiences, the medieval young are our kin, connected to us by the deep continuities of youth. There is something heartening in this recognition of what we share with the medieval young, in the sense that beneath all the strangeness, they were young people much like ourselves, living out the universal experience of youth. It reminds us of the deep continuities of human life, of the experiences that connect us across the centuries to those who came before, of the shared humanity that binds the young of every age. The medieval young, for all the wildness and strangeness of their world, were our kin in youth, living out the same fundamental experience that the young have always lived, and in recognizing this, we feel our connection to them, our shared participation in the universal experience of being young. Let that heartening reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to reflect on the gentler youth that our own age has come to enjoy. Having wandered through the hard and wild world of medieval youth, we may find ourselves looking with new eyes upon the youth of our own age, and feeling a quiet gratitude for the gentler, safer, more sheltered youth that the modern world has come to provide. This is a comforting reflection, and a fitting one to carry towards sleep. The youth of our own age is, for all its own difficulties, immeasurably gentler and safer than the youth of the medieval world, a long and sheltered stage of life in which the young are protected and educated and spared the early burdens that the medieval young were made to bear. Where the medieval young left home at 10 or 12, laboured hard from an early age, bore heavy responsibilities while still children by our reckoning, the young of our own age are given a long and protected youth, sheltered from labour, educated and cared for, allowed to grow up gradually in the safety of their families. This gentler, more protected youth is one of the real achievements of the modern world, a sparing of the young from the hard early burdens that were once their lot. The young of today enjoy a shelter and a protection that the medieval young could scarcely have imagined. Consider the differences. The young of our age are not sent away from home at 10 to labour among strangers, are not bound to years of hard apprenticeship, are not made to work from early childhood, are not thrust so early into the burdens of adult life. Instead, they are kept at home, educated, protected, allowed a long and gradual passage to adulthood, spared the early labour and responsibility that the medieval young bore. This transformation in the experience of youth, this creation of a long and sheltered adolescence, represents a real and profound change, a sparing of the young from hardships that were once simply the normal lot of the young. The youth of today is a gentler thing than the youth of the medieval world, and immeasurably so. This gentler youth reflects the broader transformations that have made our world safer and more prosperous than the medieval world. The increases in wealth and security that have allowed us to shelter our young, to spare them early labour, to give them a long and protected adolescence. The creation of modern youth was made possible by the growth of wealth and security, by the transformations that freed us from the hard necessities that once required the labour of the young. In a richer and safer world, we can afford to shelter our young, to spare them the early labour that survival once demanded, to give them the long protected youth that the medieval world could not provide. The gentler youth of our age is a fruit of the broader progress that has transformed the conditions of human life. To reflect on all this is to feel a proper gratitude for the gentler youth of our own age, brought into focus by the contrast with the hard youth of the medieval world. As you lie there in the comfort and safety of your own life, you may recognize that the young of our world enjoy a shelter and a protection, a long and gentle passage to adulthood, that the medieval young could scarcely have dreamed of. This is a real gain, a genuine progress, a sparing of the young from hardships that were once their normal lot. And it is worth remembering, worth appreciating, this gentler youth that our age has come to provide, this sheltering of the young that marks a real advance in the human condition. It is a comforting thought, and a fitting one to carry into the quiet of the night. Let that grateful reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the young people themselves, at the heart of all we have explored. As we near the end of our journey, let us turn from the customs and conditions we have explored to the young people themselves, the real young men and women of the medieval world, as human as ourselves, who lived out their youth in that distant age. For behind every custom and condition we have explored were real young people, and it is in remembering them as people that we find the deepest meaning in our journey. Think of the young people of the medieval world, leaving home so young, labouring hard, snatching their wild pleasures, falling in love, chafing against authority, living out their youth in that distant and difficult age. These were real young people, with all the energies and passions and hopes and troubles of youth, living their lives as best they could in the world they were given. Behind the customs we have explored, the apprenticeships and the services, the festivals and the brawls, the loves and the labours, were real young people, feeling the real experiences of youth, living their real lives. The wildness and the hardship were not abstractions but the lived experience of real young people, as human and as real as the young of our own age. Think of what they endured, these young people, thrust so early into the world of adult labour and responsibility, bearing burdens we would think too heavy for their years, denied the sheltered youth we regard as natural. Their early labour, their heavy responsibilities, their hard passage to adulthood, were borne by real young people, who felt the weight of these burdens as any young person would. There is something that calls forth our sympathy in this, in the hard lot of the medieval young, in the burdens they bore so young, and remembering them as real people deepens our sympathy for what they endured. They were young people made to grow up too fast, bearing hard burdens with the resilience of youth, and they deserve our sympathy and our respect. And think of the joys they knew as well, the pleasures and the loves and the revelries of their youth, the friendships and the festivities, the snatched delights that brightened their hard lives. For the medieval young knew joy as well as hardship, the joys of youth that have always brightened the lives of the young, the loves and friendships and pleasures and revelries that filled their youth alongside its burdens. Their lives were not all hardship but also held real joy, the joys of youth that they seized and savoured amid the labour and responsibility of their world. Remembering them as real people, we remember their joys as well as their hardships, the full humanity of their youthful lives. In remembering the young people of the medieval world in this way, we move beyond the mere cataloguing of customs to a deeper and more sympathetic understanding, seeing in the medieval young not strange and distant figures, but fellow human beings, young people much like ourselves, who lived out the universal experience of youth in a hard and distant age. They loved and laboured, played and suffered, hoped and feared, as the young have always done, living out their youth in the world they were given. It is right that we remember them so, with sympathy and recognition, seeing across the centuries the real young people behind all the customs and conditions, our kin, in the universal experience of youth. Let that human recognition settle gently in the dark. We turn now to our final gentle thought, the thread that connects us to them across the centuries. As our long journey through the world of medieval youth draws toward its close, let us hold one final gentle thought, a thought that reaches across all the centuries between the medieval young and our own age, and finds, in the end, a deep and human connection. For all the wildness and the strangeness of their world, the young of the medieval world were part of the same long human story of which we are part, connected to us by the deep continuities of youth. We are connected to the medieval young by the great chain of the generations, the long succession of the young growing up and growing old and giving rise to new generations of the young, that connects us across the centuries to those who came before. The young of the medieval world were part of this long succession, this great chain of the generations that stretches back through all the ages and continues in us, the young of every age growing up in their turn and passing on the torch of life. We are the descendants of the medieval young, the heirs of their world, connected to them by the unbroken chain of the generations that binds all of humanity across time. In this great succession, the medieval young are our ancestors, and we their descendants. And we are connected to them too, by the deep and enduring experience of youth, the universal experience of being young, that connects the young of every age across all the centuries that divide them. The medieval young knew the same fundamental experience of youth that we know, the same energies and passions, the same loves and rebellions, the same joys and troubles, and in this shared experience, they are connected to us across the centuries. The experience of youth is one of the great constants of human life, connecting the young of every age in a shared participation in the universal experience of being young. In this shared experience, the medieval young are our kin, connected to us across the centuries by the deep continuities of youth. There is something steadying and gentle in this thought, this sense of connection across the centuries to the young people who lived so long ago in that distant world. They are gone now, every one of them, the wild young of the medieval world, their youth long since past, their lives long since ended, all of them, long since grown old, and gone into the deep past these many centuries. But they were here, they were young, they lived out their youth with all its energies and passions and joys and troubles. They were part of the long human story that continues in us, and we are connected to them by the unbroken thread of that story, the great succession of the generations and the shared experience of youth. And so we can let them rest now, the young people of the medieval world, with a kind of tenderness and recognition, a sense of our connection to them across the centuries. Their world was hard, and their youth was wild, and we would not wish to return to it. But they were young as we have been young. They lived out the universal experience of youth, and they were part of the long human story of which we too are part. Let that gentle sense of connection settle over you now, soft and calming in the dark, as we prepare at last to let the whole long story go and drift away into sleep. Let it carry you gently toward rest, this thought of the long succession of youth of which you are a part, stretching back across the centuries to the wild young of the medieval world and far, far beyond. We turn now, at last, towards sleep. So let it all go now, gently, the whole long world we have wandered through tonight, the entire strange and wild world of medieval youth. Let it fade the way the past fades, the way the centuries dissolve into a soft and shapeless distance, the apprentices and the servants, the students and the squires, the festivals and the brawls, the loves and the labours of the medieval young, all growing dim and quiet and far away, until there is only the soft dark and your own slow breathing and the gathering tide of sleep. Let the wild young of the medieval world grow quiet and distant now. Let the alehouses fall silent, the festivals fade, the boisterous bands disperse into the deep stillness of the vanished past. Let the whole wild world of medieval youth, all its energy and all its hardship, drift gently away into the depths of time, all of them long grown old now, all of them long at rest, many centuries into the silence of the past. They are gone now, every one of them, the wild young of that distant age, their youth long since past, their lives long since ended, generation upon generation of the young grown old and gone into the deep past, and there is a great soft quiet where all their wildness once was. Let them rest, gently, in the peace of the long-vanished centuries. And now, at last, so may you. Feel the warmth and comfort of your bed, soft and safe around you. Feel how far you are from all that ancient wildness and hardship, how safe, how comfortable, how gently held by the quiet of your own night. There is nothing you need to carry from all we have explored, nothing to trouble you, no wildness to disturb the calm of your rest, only the soft dark and the deep quiet and the simple comfort of your own warm bed, many centuries away from all that we have touched upon tonight. Feel your breathing slow and your body soften, and the small cares of the day loosen their grip one by one and drift away into the warm dark until there is only you and the quiet and the deepening peace. And feel, perhaps, a quiet gratitude as you lie there, safe and comfortable, for the gentle world you inhabit, so far removed from the hard youth of that distant time, for the long journey of humanity that has carried us so far from the hardships of the medieval young. You are safe, and you are comfortable, and you are free simply to rest, in a world that has left behind so much of the hardship we have explored tonight. There is nothing to fear, and nothing to trouble you, only the soft surrender to sleep, the gentle sinking down into the warm and shapeless dark, where all is quiet and peaceful and well. The whole long story we have travelled, the whole wild world of medieval youth, can simply be set down now and released, dissolving into the soft dark, leaving you weightless and at peace, drifting gently down into sleep. And if any last image still lingers at the edge of your thoughts, some young apprentice at his bench, some band of youths at their revelry, some young couple courting at a festival, let it grow soft now, and slow, and distant, the way a dream dissolves as you slip past its edge into sleep, the images dimming, the world fading, the whole medieval world dissolving quietly into the warm and shapeless dark. You can simply let it drift away, like the day itself, like the centuries themselves, out into the quiet, and gone. Good night, traveller. The wild young of the medieval world are long grown old and gone now, all their wildness long since passed into the silence of the deep past, all of them long at rest across the great gulf of the centuries, and you are safe and warm and well, here in the gentle quiet of your own night, many centuries away. Rest easy, sleep deep, I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.